Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Scholar Gladiator, and we're back on police weapons again. Now, my first video on this subject, we looked specifically at truncheons in general in use in the Victorian period. We looked at approximately how they were probably used most of the time, and also why they were used as opposed to something else. And this is a relatively typical mid to late Victorian truncheon, probably from London, and that's exactly the sort of thing that most Victorian police, and in fact many police all over the world actually, would have carried around at this time, and in fact in many parts of the world still have truncheons exactly like this. Not usually painted in a fancy way, but nevertheless basically that shape. Next up we saw this rather intimidating looking, let's call it Lucille, truncheon with Victoria Regina on it, again VR. So another Victorian truncheon, which I'd be, as mentioned, reluctant to describe as a truncheon. I'd rather call it something like I don't know, a club, a cudgel, a bludgeon, and it's a very much more serious object, and the force in this is going to be equivalent to kind of a baseball bat. It is a large lump of heavy hardwood, and shaped in such a way to give a huge amount of impact force to whoever you're hitting. So sometimes the Victorian police did decide that they needed something more serious, and they went to that. But sometimes they decided that they wanted something even more serious than this. And what did they go to? Well, I have been asked for a while to talk about these, and I have had a few in my collection over the years, but I happen to have a particularly nice one in my collection at the moment, so I thought I'd talk about it. It is the policeman's hanger, police sword. So I believe that this is the model of around 1850, 1860. There doesn't seem to be so much written on police swords as there has been written on military swords, because there's just not as much interest in them. However, this model seems to come around in about the 1850s, 1860s and stays in use until about 1900. But when I say in use, that's not to say that police normally walked around with these. They seem to have specifically had these in very particular circumstances. And I will relate one of these circumstances in a second. But I should also mention that not only police had access to these police hangers, they were also sometimes given to railway guards. Remember that the banks, for example, moved money around the country, gold bullion, for example, or coins, sometimes for paying soldiers or paying other people, but it was moved around on the railways. So railways often contained extreme amounts of wealth being transported from one place to another. Obviously there were no trucks then, and so therefore the trains had to have a high degree of security, and so railway guards often had access to firearms, and indeed these. And finally also these were also dished out to prison guards in some situations. Then, just as now, there were occasionally prison riots or breakouts, and indeed they did require obviously firearms and more serious weapons. So let's have a little look at the actual sword. So what is it? Well, first of all, it's something, let's just grab the old French glaive or gladius. It is longer than that, okay? The police sword has a blade of around, they vary, but usually between about 20 and 24 inches, okay? You'll see that it has a shagreen, that is shark skin, let's just focus on there, shark skin grip. Sometimes it has wire in the recess, but in my experience they usually don't. It has a brass pommel cap and a brass guard. Now you may see some where the guard comes down straight here and then comes around in a curve, okay? So you've got this D-shaped one, and then you've got a type which is straight and then a curve. If it's straight and then curved, they're usually earlier, and they actually go back to the Georgian period, that is the 1700s, the late 18th century. So they first seem to have appeared in the late 1700s, and this is an 1800s one, probably from the middle or latter part of the 1800s. And these have the completely curved guard here. Okay, as you can see, they have a leather scabbard with brass fittings, comfortable, light to wear. Okay, now before I draw it out, and there's a reason I haven't drawn it out yet, there's an important feature, and it is this. Okay, so if we look there, let's focus on that button. Okay, so that is one of the things that is particular to these police swords. And I have to push that button. If I just try and pull the sword out, it won't come out, okay? And there's a very good reason for that, because if you're a policeman or a prison guard, what you don't want is when you've got your truncheon or whatever else, or just your fisticuffs, and you're trying to arrest someone, you don't want them, while you're trying to arrest them, pulling your sword out and stabbing you with it, or someone else, okay? You want to make that difficult. So you'll notice that this is known as a frog button, okay? And that means that that goes into a baldric. A baldric is a type of sword belt, okay, or a frog that hangs from a sword belt, and that hangs there, and the button is hidden behind. So actually, it's quite difficult for anybody else to, if I just stand back a bit so you can actually see, it's quite difficult for anybody else to get to that button. Okay, so to draw it, I need to reach behind, stick my thumb behind, push the button, and then it will come straight out. Okay, so that, if we just get and show here, I'll just put the scabbard, actually no, I'll keep the scabbard for a second. If we just show here, that button engages with a little spring catch there, you can see, and that in turn engages with that little catch on the inside of the scabbard. So essentially it's a spring catch. You find this on some military swords. In fact, the Japanese had something like this in World War II on some of their swords, but some of those swords, in fairness, are also for police, not necessarily military. Now, in terms of the blade, you can see that it's very much like the 1845 pattern, so-called Wilkinson style blade. That is, it is fullered for the first 2/3, and then what we would call diamond section, flattened diamond section, double-edged for the final third or quarter. So that means it's a cut and thrust blade, okay? It's slightly curved. These are fantastic cutters. I used to have one of these, I sold it. Kind of regret that actually, but I sold it, that was actually sharp. Now usually these aren't sharpened because of course policemen didn't go to war, so therefore these are not usually service sharpened. They're usually left with a fairly narrow edge, but not sharp, and this hasn't been sharpened. But I did have one that had been sharp, and having had a sharp one of these and test cut with it, I can say that absolutely they are ferocious cutters, really, really good choppers if they're sharpened up. They're very nice swords actually. And in form and size and balance and weight and stuff like this, they're actually not dissimilar to earlier hangers that we'll find in the 18th century, but equally to some hangers you'll find in the 17th, 16th and even 15th century. If we look at the general outline of a 15th century so-called archer's hanger from like the Wars of the Roses period, actually they're not very different to this. They're a similar size, similar characteristics. So these are serious weapons, despite the fact they're not normally sharpened and that they're given to police, not military. In many, many ways, if we compare sort of like with like, I would much, much rather fight with one of these police hangers than I would with the French cabbage chopper, which admittedly, as many people have correctly pointed out, was seen more of a tool than a weapon. But these, as swords, are much, much nicer. I mean, they move quickly, they've got nice balance to them, they're quick and responsive. They're not that short, you know, they're quite handy. And of course, they are longer than a lot longer than a truncheon is. So why did police have these? Well, quite simply because sometimes things escalated, okay? And so I live in Surrey. I live in a town called Guildford. Guildford in the 19th century is a good illustration of why the police had these. So for a period of time, for several decades, it was popular on Guy Fawkes night. So I would imagine everybody in the UK knows what Guy Fawkes is, or who he was, and what Guy Fawkes night is, the 5th of November. And essentially he was someone who in the 17th century tried to blow up Parliament. Maybe not such a bad idea, but he tried to blow up Parliament, he got caught, he was a Catholic, he was a terrorist essentially of his time, and he got caught and obviously tried and killed and this kind of stuff, and he made a confession which has since been questioned about how true it is and this kind of stuff. But Guy Fawkes night is a kind of night where in Britain everybody goes out with fireworks and makes a model of Guy and burns him and does this big celebration. But in the 19th century, it was also used as a rallying call for rioters. And so in Guildford, there grew up to be an organisation, a secret organisation called the Guildford Guys. Now what the Guildford Guys did is they used Guy Fawkes Night as an opportunity to go looting. And they essentially went around smashing up shop fronts, fighting with the police and stealing stuff. So basically they were criminals, okay? But they were rioters. And they were rioters who, some were from Guildford, some were from surrounding towns or countryside, and came in to cause trouble and steal some stuff, basically. And the Guildford Guy Riots, and you could search for these on Google yourself, Guildford Guy, G-U-Y, the Guildford Guy Riots got worse and worse. And a policeman eventually got killed one year and all this kind of stuff. And every year the police would have to turn out and have to fight with these rioters. It was like something out of Gangs of New York. And eventually, so Guildford's not that far away from a place called Aldershot. Now Aldershot was the spiritual and in many ways factual home of the British Army. Okay, and so eventually the Guildford guys rioted so badly that the authorities in Guildford called to Aldershot for the cavalry to come. And the local, I can't remember which regiment it was, but a local regiment, a regiment of lancers who at the time were stationed at Aldershot, came to Guildford and conducted a cavalry charge down the high street with lances and cleared out the rioters. And as I understand it, there was never a riot ever again. Make of that story what you will. But anyway, there we go. So the fact is, really, that story is just to illustrate. Apart from that, it's an interesting thing that I think you should go and read about because it's an interesting bit of history that's fairly unknown to most people. It illustrates the fact that police sometimes did get into pretty serious hand-to-hand fighting in the 19th century. And it wasn't only with rioters or criminals as you'd normally think of them. It was also sometimes to do with smugglers, okay? So if we look at the Port of London, for example, often you get pretty hardcore criminal gangs operating smuggling operations into and out of the Port of London or any other big port, okay? Could be Liverpool or whatever. So quite simply, the police sometimes came up against some quite angry and ferocious opponents. And also, don't think that terrorism is a modern thing. Terrorism existed in the 19th century. As it happens, my great-great-grandfather, who was the chief of Glasgow Police, was actually involved in catching a bunch of, well, he was involved in, that's for another video, but he was involved in essentially a group of people who were known as the dynamitards. And they were essentially people who were blowing things up in the 19th century. But I'll cover that in another video. It's quite interesting. But anyway, just really to cut a long story short, sometimes, and this was known as drawing cutlasses. So I should mention, and I'll put a picture on your screen now. So this is the Metropolitan Police training with cutlasses, doing cutlass drill. And in fact, there is a police training manual that actually gives the cutlass drill, and it is based on Henry Angelo's infantry sword exercise. And it is intended for this sword. So you can buy these antique swords, you can read the manuals, you can train them. It's very similar to Angelo's infantry officer's sword exercise. And these were known as police cutlasses, although we'd usually call them a hanger now because we tend to think of the more simple guard as a hanger rather than a bigger guard being a cutlass. So there we go. Really, sometimes the conventional truncheon just wasn't enough. Sometimes bigger truncheons and bigger sticks weren't enough, and sometimes the police felt the need to draw cutlasses, and most police stations in Victorian Britain had a bunch of these in their storeroom, and these were occasionally dished out to policemen on patrol if they thought that they might need them. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. Oh, and just one thing to say as well, this particular example will be going for sale, a little bit of a plug, on Eastern Antique Arms, and this is an unusual one because it's made by Robert Mole of Birmingham. Most of these are made by Parker Field and Sons of London, or at least retailed by Parker Field and Sons. We don't actually know who made them, but this one's actually marked to Mole of Birmingham, which makes this fairly unusual. Mole, of course, who were famous for making army swords. Anyway, I'm going to finish up there. Maybe I'll talk some more about police swords in the future. In fact, I'm pretty sure I will, because I've got another interesting one that I'd like to show you guys. And I'll see you for the next video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We've got extra videos on Patreon, t-shirts on Spreadshirt, and I hope to see you for the next video.